One of the reasons I wanted to cover that context is because if you're asking those questions, what do we know? What should we be doing? What perspective are you asking the question from? Right? Are you asking and answering those questions from a traditional perspective, from a modern perspective, from a postmodern perspective, or from an integrated, metamodern, post-formal, developmentally appropriate, process-oriented framework, right? So part of what I want to argue is that that's the perspective that we need to find a way to inhabit and enact as we even are thinking about these questions. So what we know is that cognitive learning and social-emotional learning are both addressed when developmental needs are addressed, right? So when we're looking at the development of the whole person, that's including cognitive development and emotional development. So it's an overly fragmented mistake to separate those things too much. And part of what evolving through more complex perspective means is that you're able to differentiate and integrate, right? So you can differentiate things like cognitive learning and social emotional learning, but you have to be able to actually integrate them too and see the educational process as a fundamentally and inherently integrative process where all those things are happening in relationship to each other. So we know that engagement is key, and we know that relationship is critical, right? Nothing is happening in isolation. We're always in relationship. And our children, our species has evolved to be in a crucible of relationship with other people. So those relationships are key. We cannot reduce learning to the input of information or the ability to regurgitate facts, right? There's a more holistic and complex framework for understanding what's happening when we think about learning. We know that children learn from people they love, right? We know that emotion is central to reason, to motivation, to attention, and to memory. If you're going to differentiate those things, you have to find a way to integrate them again. You can't keep them separate. We know that children do not learn from screens or technology the same way that they learn from people, right? That is becoming an established fact when you look at studies they're doing with young children trying to teach them language through technology. They're just not absorbing the information in the same way. You need an embodied relational presence to really activate your brain in the way that our species has evolved to activate our brains. And we know that fear and anxiety cripple learning and neurological functioning. So we have to have safe spaces where kids are secure and securely attached so that they can be free to kind of be online for learning and processing and thinking and not shutting down. So one way of thinking about the learning process, I like this model from Edward Hallowell because it starts with connection, right? And you have to have a community of people who are connected to each other authentically. And then in that connection, people are playing together. And it could just as easily say work. Play and work, there's really no need to make a fundamental distinction between them. It's about being engaged in activities where you're getting feedback from what you're doing. Whether it's play or work kind of depends on how much fun you're having. But either way, you're interacting with the world and other people, and that's how we learn, right? So that's just another way of framing what practice is as we play and work. We're practicing whatever skills it is that we're playing and working on. And through that process, we develop mastery, right? We get better at what we do. It's pretty straightforward. And through that authentic mastery, we get recognition from our community, right? And that recognition deepens our connection, right? So it can be a virtuous circle that is rooted in connection, where you're playing and working and learning and practicing with others. You're getting authentic and meaningful feedback, so you're not doing something that's too hard for you and failing and having people say, oh, good job, like that was great. Because no, like it wasn't great. Maybe you're not doing well and you need that authentic feedback, right? But if the relationships are strong and meaningful and loving, you can actually handle that authentic feedback. You don't need everything to be sugar-coated, right? Children need to be pushed and nudged and not just left to their own devices. So I'll talk about that some more too, because sometimes we want to go to one extreme or the other, either having a really standardized authoritarian telling children what to do, or just letting them play and do what they want all the time. And neither one of those approaches is really holding the dynamic tension that creates the creative friction that development requires, right? So a key point too is that connection is the root of moral behavior and moral development. You cannot didactically teach morals. Telling someone to be good is not an effective teaching method, right? People are good when they genuinely feel connected to other people. They want to do good for them, right? You feel connected to a group and you learn how to be giving and generous and responsive to those people. And then as you get older, that circle can expand, right? And you can start to genuinely care about other people as you develop. But if the connection isn't there and if it's not authentic, no amount of lessons about goodness or morality is going to do much to really help people become moral beings and actually go through the stages of moral development. So that connection and relationship is key, and it needs to be at the center of any educational environment. And mastery, as I sort of pointed out before, mastery is the root of self-esteem, right? Telling someone things about them, whether good or bad, is not the way to build up their self-esteem. Children need to be actually successful, which is why developmental appropriateness is so important, right? So as we're thinking about what's developmentally appropriate, we need to be thinking about how we're setting kids up for success to actually experience real success and real progress, where it doesn't matter whether the adult says they're doing good or not. They know whether they're doing good or not. They're experiencing it directly, and they need adults who are going to verify that direct and accurate perception and not go against it, right? So that's really important for parents and teachers too. We want to build our kids up and we want to give them positive feedback. They're already experiencing directly whether they're doing good or not. We need to be attuned enough to actually help them make adjustments so that they can do good in whatever they're doing, whether that means bringing the complexity down a little bit so that they can be successful, or ramping it up a little bit because they're not being challenged, right? So that there's that attunement, and that connection is key. So another aspect that I want to talk about, thinking more about early childhood development, is how important story, narrative, fantasy, myth, and pretend play are, right? So through these activities, they're developing language and their persona. They're being provided with emotional catharsis and emotional processing through different personas. They're developing the building blocks for sequential thinking and abstract thinking, binary structuring and sort of ordering the world. It's the foundation for making sense of the world, right? We need, that's the level at which we should be having these binaries, is when you're 3, 4, 5 years old. It's okay to think in terms of good and bad when you're 3, 4, and 5, right? It's okay. It's not so okay when you're 35. We should be beyond that. But that doesn't mean we can't let our kids develop these fundamental structures when they're young. And metaphor and imagination are developing those conceptual structures. So pretend play fosters symbolic thought, abstraction, imagination, and interpersonal intelligence, right? Because it's usually in a school context, in the context of relationship and play and playing with other people and having to figure out what are the rules, what are the parameters, what's going to have an impact on other people. That kind of free play with other kids is developing that interpersonal intelligence and also that intrapersonal intelligence in terms of figuring out what's going on inside of yourself. So important when we're thinking about, especially the first 5, 6, 7 years of life, to make sure that kids have adequate time and space to really be doing their thing. So there does need to be some element of free play. Not all free play all the time, but it's important to not take it away. I want to talk a little bit too about literacy and technology, because these are big questions and issues for parents of young children especially. So one thing to think about here is the timing of skill development and brain development, right? So knowing how the brain develops is an important thing for education. One thing that's happening in the brain over the early years of life is brain myelination. So a myelin is a membrane structure that surrounds the axons in the brain and allows electrical insulation and increases the speed of brain processing and proper functioning of the nervous system. And that's happening in different parts of the brain at different times. So it takes time for different parts of the brain to be myelinated, and that sort of means being activated, being ready, being conducive for really connecting to other parts. And what's going on with reading is that because reading evolved relatively late in our species development, there is not a reading part of the brain, and you're just waiting for that to come online. There's actually different parts of the brain that have to be relating to each other in order for the process of reading to be activated. And that timing is going to be different for every kid. It typically is adequately myelinated by the time they're 7, right? So, and you see this in traditional societies that maybe we're actually more tuned in to their kids, that the sort of natural school age is like 6 or 7 often, right? Like first grade is really the time to start focusing in on more of those discrete skills in terms of decoding text. Prior to that, some kids, it clicks quicker. Great. There's really no long-term benefit to that, though, which is something that it's good for parents to know. There's no long-term benefit for a 3, 4, or 5-year-old to be able to decode text as opposed to just getting it at 6 or 7 or 8. So the research is really clear on that. What there is there are negative social outcomes if natural differences are presented as deficiencies, right? So if you have a group of 5-year-olds, some of them are decoding text and some aren't, and if they're in a social educational environment where somehow that is expressed or perceived or interpreted as some sort of deficiency or problem, then that's affecting their relationships, that's affecting their self-concept, that's affecting their intrapersonal intelligence. So we're doing damage to children who just have natural diversity and are really at no inherent developmental disadvantage, and yet socially we're treating it like it's a problem, we're treating it like it's a disadvantage, we're taking away their playtime to focus on reading when there's no long-term benefit to that, and we're throwing off the sort of natural process of emergence that they're going through over those first 7 years. So that's really, really key. And again, when you take a more modern, linear, sort of quasi-pseudo-rational approach to education, which is what we're all swimming in, and we have this notion of backwards planning where it's like, well, if by 12th grade they need to get this score on their test to go to college, that means by 9th grade they need to be here, and 5th grade they need to be here, and 1st grade they need to be here. Therefore, if all kindergartners are at this benchmark, then they'll be more on pace to graduate and go to Harvard. And that's just not intelligent. It's not complex thinking, right? That's not the way development happens. We are not machines, right? It's not a factory. Children are much more like caterpillars and butterflies than they are things that can be put together on an assembly line, right? So we have to sort of embrace the sort of nonlinear emergent nature and these natural phase shifts that children go through, and get a sense of how that unfolds. So that's crucial, and that's something that we could do a lot better of in schools.